right.
Hello, I'm Heather Kostick, the admin coordinator for the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media. Welcome to our event, What is ESG, Why It Matters, and Why You Should Pay Attention. While you're walking in, please feel free to get some pizza. There's some Energy Week swag here. This event is part of Penn Energy Week, which is organized by the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy and the Vagelos Institute for Energy Science and Technology. I encourage you to check out the full list of events at energyweek.upenn.edu. Thank you for joining us both in person and online. I'm going to introduce our moderator, Dr. Michael Mann, and our four panelists. And then Dr. Mann will open our event with a couple of remarks, and then we'll get started. Dr. Michael E. Mann is the Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania, with a secondary appointment in the Annenberg School for Communication. He received an AB in Physics and Applied Math from UC Berkeley, and an MS in Physics and PhD in Geology and Geophysics from Yale. Dr. Mann is founding director for the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media, and is the author of more than 200 peer-reviewed and edited publications, numerous op-eds and commentaries, and 6 books, including forthcoming Our Fragile Moment, How Lessons from Earth's Past Can Help Us Survive the Climate Crisis. He's also a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a recipient of numerous awards and prizes, including the Tyler Prize, often called the Nobel Prize for Environmental Science. And then our first panelist is Claudine Gartenberg. She's an assistant professor of management at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on corporate purpose and pay inequality and the implications of both for firm strategy and competitiveness. Her work has been published in top academic journals, including Management Science, Organization Science, and Strategic Management Journal. She's an associate editor at Management Science and serves on the editorial boards of Strategic Management Journal and Strategy Science. Professor Gartenberg received a BA with honors in physics from Harvard College and a DBA and MBA from Harvard Business School, where she graduated as a Baker Scholar and received the Weiss Award for her best doctoral research. She joins Wharton from the faculty of NYU Stern School. Prior to joining academia, Professor Gartenberg was an account manager at a business consulting firm working with clients such as PG&E, Chevron, Hallmark Cards, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America. Vit Henisz is the Vice Dean and Faculty Director of the ESG Initiative and Deloitte and Touche Professor of Management in honor of Russell E. Palmer at the Wharton School, the University of Pennsylvania. He received his PhD in Business and Public Policy from the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. His research examines the impact of political hazards as well as environmental, social, and governance factors more broadly in the strategy and valuation of global corporations. He's won multiple teaching awards and led the development of Wharton's school new ESG executive education programs. He also serves as an advisor to multinational firms, asset managers, including Engine No. 1, for whom he developed the Total Value Framework, intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations. Lolita Jackson MBE is the executive director of Sustainable Cities at Sustainable Development Capital LLP, a multi-billion-pound FTSE 250 climate investment firm. Jackson is a frequent speaker at global gatherings and universities on the topics of climate diplomacy and public and private sector engagement on climate. She is also currently a Perry Worldhouse Fellow. She previously worked for the New York City Mayor's Office for 15 years in a variety of roles. Lastly, as a special advisor for climate policy and programs, where she was the climate diplomat for New York City. Jackson is a member of the British American Project's U.S. Advisory Board, a member of Global Scott, a trustee of the Jazz Museum in Harlem, and president of the Penn Alumni Class of 1989. She was named to the City and State's Energy and Environment Power 100 list for 2022 and was named a member of the Order of the British Empire in 2021. Jackson is a professional singer, having performed on 4 continents and at Carnegie Hall. She's an alumni of the University of Pennsylvania School of Engineering and Applied Science, majoring in applied science with a concentration in chemical engineering. And then finally, our last panelist to be introduced is Dr. Sarah E. Light. She's an associate professor of legal studies and business ethics at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, where she teaches courses related to environmental management, law and policy, as well as business, social responsibility, and the environment, among others. Light serves as co-faculty director of the Wharton Climate Center, one of our co-organizers for today, as well as the advisor to both the undergraduate concentration and MBA major in business, energy, environment, and sustainability. Her research examines issues at the intersection of environmental law, corporate sustainability, and business innovation. Prior to joining the Wharton faculty, Professor Light served for 10 years as an assistant United States attorney for the Southern District of New York, including 4 years as chief of the Environmental Protection Unit. Professor Light earned her JD from Yale Law School and a master's in philosophy in politics from Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar, and an AB from Harvard College. So, with all those introductions out of the way, I welcome Dr. Mann up to the podium, who will do some opening remarks, and then we'll get to our panel.
Well, thanks very much, Heather, and thanks to our panel for coming together, and thanks to all of you for coming out for this event. We'd like to think it isn't just for the free pizza, but for the conversation as well. Sometimes, you plan an event, and we've been planning for some months now this particular event on ESG, and it just so happens that by the time the event actually comes to fruition, sort of natural events sort of conspire to really underscore the salience of the topic at hand. And that's certainly true here. And I would note two things. First of all, the news this morning when I turned on the television continues to be focused on the latest, banking crisis, sort of the aftermath of the Silicon Valley Bank SVB collapse now about 2 weeks ago. And what's been interesting is the sort of policy and political debate over the cause of that collapse, with some arguing that it was, for example, the deregulation, the Dodd-Frank bill, the nullification of Dodd-Frank that sort of played into the increasingly risky behavior that some of these smaller banks are taking, not so small in this case, and others arguing that, in fact, this is a result of woke politics and the incorporation of things like ESG into investment and decision-making in the financial industry. So there is a larger theme here, which is that ESG, and we're going to talk about just what that is. Many of you in the room are probably familiar with it, but some of you, both here and online, may not be. ESG has sort of become both part of the rallying call for climate action and for sustainability and climate-driven investing, and it's become a rallying call for the opponents who view this as just another manifestation of quote, wokeness, now impacting the financial industry. And so it's really the conversation that we're having today is really central to the larger conversation that we're having right now, writ large, with respect to climate and sustainability. And so I'm so excited that we've brought together literally some of the leading experts around to talk about ESG. What is it? What does it really mean? And what are the challenges and obstacles? And why is it that it is being so heavily criticized in some circles? And what's the nature of those criticisms? And how do we potentially combat that if we believe that ESG is indeed intrinsic to any sort of climate forward or sustainability forward agenda? And so I will now join the panel and start out by asking a question of our panelists. We will start out with the question of, what is ESG? What is the role of the financial sector as a catalyst for climate action? And how does it complement, for example, oh, I forgot the other thing. The other thing that happened today was that we just received the synthesis report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That just came out this morning. And if you Google News, you'll see it's dominating the headlines. No real surprises. It's a synthesis report, which means it's based on essentially a summary of the findings of the previous IPCC reports. And again, there's no surprise there. What this report conveys is both the urgency of climate action, but also the agency that we still have in addressing it. And so that also provides an important context for our conversation today. So building on that, again, what is the role of the financial sector as a catalyst for climate action? How does it complement government or intergovernmental policy? And I'll first address that to Vit.
Thanks, Michael. I was hoping by now there'd be one more good reason to have this panel today. It hasn't quite happened yet, but today I think is the last day that President Biden can issue his first veto, overturning the House and Senate's repeal of his effort to reinstate the ability to use ESG investments in American pension funds, the Department of Labor regulation. I think today is the 10th day, not including Sundays, since the bill was brought to his desk. So eagerly awaiting that veto. What is ESG? For many decades, some investors for religious and other grounds have wanted to look at non-financial factors as part of their investment thesis. Quakers didn't want to invest in guns. Different religious beliefs have different exclusions. But over time, there started being an argument that there might be a financial case for excluding or including certain non-traditional financial factors, especially those around environmental, social, and governance factors. And in a 2004 United Nations report, they tried to separate the financial argument for taking into account environmental, social, and governance factors from those focused more on ethics, responsible investing, religious beliefs, or others, and came up with this label of ESG. And it was meant to distinguish it from CSR, SRI, other terms, saying there's a business case here. Climate risk is investment risk. A shorter phrase that Larry Fink has been saying many times in recent years in an audited form this year in his letter. The idea that some assets are going to be underwater, some technologies associated with green tech are going to boom in value. And your question in terms of why is this important? In order to reach a 1.5 to 2 degree scenario, the estimates I've seen are a requirement of somewhere between $50 and $150 trillion of capital expenditures. That amount of CapEx just isn't available from public sources. And so we're going to have to mobilize private capital in order to realize the promise of an energy transition. And in order to do that, we need to show the business case. Now, that can be by incorporating policies, incorporating new technologies, incorporating cost curves, incorporating downside risk. But something needs to be incorporated, we need to show the business case. And the ESG movement is an effort to do just that.
Thanks so much. It's great. Lolita, so some comments from you.
Sure. So I want to sort of bring my worlds together, like that thin sliver of the Venn diagram. Because I actually worked for Morgan Stanley for 12 years, older than I look. Worked for Morgan Stanley for 12 years before I worked for Mayor's Office for 15 years, and now I'm back in the private sector. So I have a kind of a unique viewpoint into this, particularly because I worked on every climate plan New York City's ever done, from 2007 to 2019. And I want to talk a little bit about the intersection of those two things. So the first is that I went to my first COP, and it was COP 26. It was amazing. I was there the entire 2 weeks, really long time, but lots of side events. There was a lot of excitement because it was the first time that cities and mayors and governors were being recognized, not in the actual negotiations, but many, many side events. Nancy Pelosi brought 20 Congress people, 6 cabinet secretaries. It's amazing. And I'm sure you were there and saw some of this. And my own firm even hosted an event there. So the corporates also were really engaged to a very high degree. And the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero came out of that, where many, many firms had dedicated that they were going to spend some money in this realm. So I think people walked away really excited, but obviously the uptick in engagement has been a little bit dialed back because of the situation in Ukraine and still dealing with COVID hangovers and things like that. But it's still moving, is what I wanted to tell people. Companies are still doing this. And there's $369 billion out there in federal spending that's going to start happening. And the corporates obviously want to definitely plug into that. In fact, my firm frantically looked at what are the tax credits we can get. So just know that people really want to be able to be engaged in that. And cities also know that they need some outside financing and private sector involvement to get there. So something that a lot of you may not know is that there are these climate networks called C40, climate mayors, et cetera, where every major global city has to have a climate plan or they get kicked out. So almost all of them have these plans, but a lot of them don't have any money, particularly because many of these plans were put together before COVID happened. And so you need that private financing to come alongside to help those cities do that. I think that public-private partnerships become more prevalent, and I'll give you a few examples that are very recent in the UK. So Greater Manchester has partnered with a company called Daikon, which is a Japanese company that provide 1,000 homes with retrofits and HVAC and energy efficiency measures. And they're also providing a job training center for the area. So something key to know is that many municipalities, when they're partnering with these firms, they're saying you have to provide jobs because when you're gone, we need these folks who are suffering from environmental justice to be able to actually get jobs doing other projects. And you're seeing that happen in Aberdeen with people transitioning from the oil industry to renewables, et cetera. Another one is called Bristol City Leap. It's a project in Bristol, England, with Amoresco as a partner. £1 billion of energy investment over the next 20 years in Bristol. 500 million pounds over the next 5. So it's going to be solar, heat pumps, wind, and 1,000 jobs. Again, it's about jobs. So my company's in this space. We provided Tesco with all their solar panels, all the ones that have solar panels in the UK, as well as Santander Bank, all the branches in the UK with LED lighting. So there's many companies doing this. And then the last piece I'll say, I'm almost done. I'm actually currently writing a paper on climate finance in cities, and conducted 20 interviews of people, both the public and private sector, with a colleague named Kunal Khatri, who's actually a Wharton MBA student here now. And a couple of key things that came out of that. The first is that both sides, the public and private, commented on timelines and the need to shorten them. So my 3 Ps are policies, procurement, and permits. They all need to be changed in order to have working offshore wind farms. There's one working offshore wind farm that's not a pilot in the United States. So think about that, because the timelines of transmission lines, of getting the permissions, the NIMBYism, it's a lot slower to get these projects done here. So we need the will to have those happen. COVID showed that you can actually shorten those timelines if you really need to. So we need to have that as a climate emergency. Secondly, cities need capacity and expertise, and the private sector needs to be more engaged and proactive to help with this and problem solve. So the deals will be unlocked if they're willing to put in more effort on the front end. And the third thing, that projects need scale in order to attract the private capital. So my company's not going to invest in EV charging in rural Orkney, Scotland, unless we can also get some business in Glasgow and Edinburgh. So think about joint procurement, thinking about ways to link these things together. This has been done, one last example of this has been done with cities in the United States around electric vehicle charging. Not charging, excuse me, electric vehicles for their fleets. So there's an organization called Climate Mayors, where I think they brought together about 20 cities to actually do a joint procurement for that. So then a lot of people want to jump in, and because it's a scale that they can use. So
Thanks, that's also helpful and interesting. We're going to move on to the next question. This is an opportunity for me to either show my brilliance or expose my ignorance. To me, as an outsider, doesn't have expertise in this area, it's just always seemed to me that environmental stewardship is a natural extension of the concept of fiduciary responsibility. Surely, companies have a fiduciary responsibility not to destroy the planet that their clients live on and that their clients' children and grandchildren will inherit. So I'm wondering if you could enlighten us. Is that a reasonable way of looking at this? And if not, can you provide us some further context?
So that's a big question. So I'll give my answer, and any of the other panelists can jump in if they have a different perspective on this. So I study, who's the corporation managed? When you think about the bulk of, what we do, what we produce, what the economy does, a lot of it is done within the walls of for-profit corporations. And so for who do they serve is a really important question that we think about in law schools and in business schools also. And so, there's principles that, seem morally right, that seem socially right, but ultimately some of this actually has to rest on, what does the law say, right? So fiduciary responsibility, the idea of fiduciary duties is actually a legal construct, as is the corporation, which is a legal fiction that we all need to go by. So we start from there. So for who does the corporation serve? So there's actually an interesting report that came out this year. So there's a group of legal scholars and practitioners and judges called the American Law Institute. And what they do, we live in a common law country, is they go around and they look at all the rulings and all the court cases that have gone on for, since the last time, a couple decades in this case, and they say, what have we learned? And then let's come up with some statement of principles from what the courts are saying. And so the American Law Institute just reissued something called the Principles of corporate governance. The last time it was done was in 1994. They have a draft out from 2022. I think the final will come out sometime this year. And in that, they actually redefined what is the objective of a corporation? For whom does the corporation serve? And the last time they looked at it was the early 90s, and they just looked at for today. So I actually brought it with me because I think it's useful. We have to understand what the law says. And so the objective of the corporation, as recognized in American law, is to enhance the economic value of the corporation within the boundaries of the law for the benefit of the corporation's shareholders. And if you're in a stakeholder jurisdiction state, which is some other states, including Delaware, and or for some other stakeholders as well, customers, constituencies, communities. And so what they've done in this is they've said the fiduciary responsibility of the board, which is the legal construct, is to maximize enhance the economic value of the corporation for the benefit of the owners and to the degree that it's reasonable for the other stakeholders that are involved. Now, that gives a lot of discretion for boards to incorporate social impact a lot, but not infinite, not infinite. And so typically where boards are landing on this is they say, look, let's take a long horizon. And the longer the horizon you can take, the more you internalize the negative externalities that you impose on the communities, on the environment and whatnot. So if we can take a very long-term horizon, then we can incorporate stakeholder concerns to the extent that we can justify it for our fiduciary responsibilities. But what we can't do is sort of infinite environmental stewardship. That's where government comes in. So there's a huge role for regulation and for government here, and it can't all be fobbed off on firms, but it can be fobbed off on corporations to the extent that you can make a business case over the long run.
Thanks. Yeah. The others, yeah.
I wish I could just model that and teach it to my students. I absolutely agree with Claudine's assessment. I think at the end of the day, this is, this is driven by law, and the way that corporate law operates in the United States is that each state has its own legal provisions that govern corporations. And if you had asked someone maybe in the 1940s or 50s, what's the purpose of a corporation? You probably would have gotten an answer like, the purpose of a corporation is to produce goods and services that are of use, that people want to buy, to provide jobs in the community. If you asked that question in the 1970s or 80s, you would have gotten a very sort of, the purpose of a corporation is to maximize profits in the short term for shareholders, the owners of equity in the corporation. And I think now we're moving to this world that recognizes the way that we need to think about the purpose of a corporation is in a much more long-term posture. And so I absolutely agree with Claudine's comment. I think that it's important to understand that there are certain situations in which that may be narrower and certain situations in which that may be broader, either based on the law of the states, some of which have literally enshrined the ability of corporations to take stakeholder interests, those customers, employees, the local community into account, and other situations in which there's less discretion. One area in which this is coming up a lot is in pension fund management. And pension managers have even more arguably strict duties of loyalty and prudence to ensure that your retirement funds are safe. But again, when we think about these from a long-term perspective, right, taking into account climate risk is a way of de-risking a portfolio, right? If you know that you're going to invest in assets and those assets are at a certain point going to be banned, you can no longer do oil and gas extraction, or the assets being, mortgages in Florida are literally underwater and are, have lost all their value. Taking those factors into account is financial. And so what I think is really interesting, and this kind of ties back to Vit's first point, is that the ESG approach to these issues is defining the problem as well as the tools that can be used in terms of a fiduciary duty of a company, right? These are financial interests that a firm needs to take into account. This is not, we're doing this for moral reasons, profits be damned, right? And I think that that's a really important aspect of why this approach is gaining traction in a way that maybe some earlier sort of moral-based approaches to responsible investing maybe have been smaller.
Please, yeah.
So I actually worked in one of my many hats in the mayor's office of New York City. I worked with the team that decided to divest from fossil fuels in New York City. And it was a long road because our pension fund trustees are the unions. So really the way we were able to convince them is we actually made the financial case. Mercer did a study for us and showed that the particular index, when you took away the energy stocks, actually was higher. We had to do it by the numbers, and then you were able to go go further because they didn't want it to be politicized. So there is a way forward with that when you actually use numbers and not just the moral arguments.
Can I jump in on one other point? So in a lot of the financial arguments for ESG, a lot of them focus on either, de-risking, compliance, regulation, and transparency, right? Giving sort of visibility into the operations of the company. And you can make very good financial arguments on that. There's another piece of it that I think people overlook, or at least that I focus on as well, which is if you look at companies' balance sheets, in the 1970s, the bulk of them, 60, 70% of them were tangible assets. They were plant, they were inventory, they were, materials, and that was the business model that for much of the 20th century American business was based on. That is completely inverted to today. So today, when you look at balance sheets of companies, depending on how you calculate intangible assets, most of the companies, the bulk of companies, the value in the companies are in intangibles. So think about people, expertise, patents, capabilities, innovation. The nature of the structure of the economy has fundamentally changed over the last 70 years. And when you look at where you get the most value, a lot of that is held in the people. And what are people motivated by? People are motivated not so much by extrinsic incentive, money, rewards. I mean, they need that. You need that because you need to build wealth and security over time. But people are really motivated by meaning. And so companies, there's industries, not every industry, but many industries have done studies on this, where the higher the sense of meaning and purpose that your employees have is actually related to how well those companies financially perform. And so when you think about a lot of the companies that are in this sector, smart meters, grid balancing, you can even go beyond energy and think about, proprietary pharmaceutical development, innovative scientific research. When you think about the companies that are most successful there, those are the companies where the employees come and they say, we want to have an impact, we want to have meaning, and that translates to companies that are financially important. So that's another really critical aspect of this ESG debate, which is that you get longer term performance in these companies based on intangibles when you're engaged in a mission that actually has some kind of social spillovers or social benefits, much more so than ones that have this sort of traditional, shareholder maximization purpose.
Great. I'm going to assert moderator's privilege to tell a short anecdote here. When I was down under for my last sabbatical in Australia, and I went there to do research on the impact of climate change on extreme weather events in Australia, only to arrive during what has now come to be known as the Black Summer, when wildfires spread out across the continent, the devastating impacts, in that case, of climate change, which have actually changed the whole conversation on Australia. But one of the things that I was spending some of my time doing was meeting with managers of super funds, superannuation funds, basically, pension funds. And because of Australian law, some of the largest pension funds in the world are in Australia. And to a person, they all wanted to do something on climate. They felt it was their responsibility to do so, but they were looking for justification for it within the confines of their own rules. And I think one of the things that they struggle with, there are two kinds of risk that are discussed here. There's transition risk, which is easy to say. If we think the fossil fuel industry is going to go under, that makes them a bad investment. So that's one type of risk that you enter into when you're dealing with the fossil fuel industry. But then there's climate risk, the actual damages from climate change, and that's harder to define and incorporate. Does anyone have any further thoughts about that particular matter, the distinction between those types of risk? And,
Well, I mean, I think the transition risk, I don't know that it's easier, honestly. I mean, I think at some level, I view it, I guess maybe I don't have the scientific background that you do, but I think the physical risk of like how much their sea level is going to go up, how much your temperature is going to go up, and then linking that to assets is actually the easier challenge. How we get to a 1.5 degree scenario. Is it a carbon tax or is it subsidies? Does the US lead or lag? When does China engage? I mean, figuring out the transition path, and then also how do the cost curves keep coming down on solar and wind, or do they accelerate? Do we accelerate the development of offshore wind or not? I mean, modeling the transition risk is really hard. So I think that's at some level the bigger challenge when we're trying to bring ESG factors in, because we're saying we want to bring environmental factors into valuation models. Okay, well, what's an offshore wind farm going to be worth, and how many of them are there going to be in 2030? And all these companies have climate action plans. Are they serious about them? Will Say on Climate actually hold firms accountable and oust the boards like engine number 1 did with ExxonMobil? Or will Say on Climate kind of, fizzle? There are a lot of big uncertainties, and I mean, those are some of the real challenges and the real opportunities in investing on ESG. It's figuring out transition risk.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's gratuitous of me to talk about, emphasize physical risk, because of course as a climate scientist, that's something we can actually talk about. But if you look at the reports, the IPCC report that came out today, the synthesis report, you'll see that one of the huge remaining uncertainties is the stability of the ice sheets. How close are we to the point of massive loss of ice from West Antarctica and Greenland, which takes us from feet of sea level rise to meters of sea level rise. And so from a risk standpoint, you probably want to minimize that tail risk. If there's even some small probability of massive inundation, that's a problem. And I do want to go on, though, now to get to our last question of the panel before we sort of go into Q&A and discussion mode here, which is for Sarah. I sort of prefaced today's event with some remarks about the way that ESG is now being sort of weaponized by opponents of climate action, being labeled as everything, This is a woke pile of paper I have here. Everything has become woke, and ESG, of course, is being attacked as woke politics interfering with the marketplace. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Yes, absolutely. So ESG has been criticized from both sides of the political spectrum, right? On the liberal side or the left side of the political spectrum, it's not deep enough, it's not going far enough, this is all greenwashing. On the right, the criticism is this is woke capitalism, right? This is just politics masquerading as finance, and it's not really real. Well, so one of the reasons why Wharton created the ESG initiative is because there are actually empirical studies that demonstrate the de-risking capability of taking environmental factors into account, or social and governance factors. But we have colleagues on the faculty. So one of our colleagues in the finance department, Dan Garrett, published a paper. So a number of states, you may have read about this in the news, a number of states have recently passed laws basically limiting the ability of state agencies to enter into contracts with financial companies that, quote, boycott energy firms. So that's the technical term in the statute. There are similar laws on the S side. We're not going to do business with a financial company that boycotts gun manufacturing. And there are other states that have adopted rules that say our pension funds are not going to do business with financial institutions that do any kind of ESG investing. There needs to be divestment from these firms. In Texas, which was the first state to pass one of these laws, when the state passed this law, related to whether municipal governments, so city governments in Texas, could issue bonds, and what were going to be the major banks that were going to underwrite those bond offerings. So if you're a city and you want to build a bridge or repair a bridge and you don't have the money, maybe you issue bonds through JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs in order to raise the funds to build the bridge or to do the infrastructure project. So when Texas passed its law, Dan Garrett and his co-author found that the 5 largest underwriters, Goldman and JP Morgan and these various major banks, all left the market for municipal bond underwriting. And as a result, there was going to be an additional $302 to $532 million in interest payments for the 8-month period that those financial institutions left the market. So that's a really concrete finding. Second empirical study, this one was really interesting. So the Kansas State Legislature, I hope it's okay. The Kansas State Legislature was considering one of these anti-ESG laws. And the law was basically going to prohibit the state and its agencies from doing business with any financial company that took ESG factors into account, and would essentially say expressly, fiduciary duty does not allow you to consider ESG factors. So overriding the judgment of the financial managers. So Kansas has a public pension system, and its public pension system did an analysis, and the analysis was recently published, and basically they found that this would essentially require the state to divest from 100% of the companies with whom they did business. It would require terminating all of the contracts and restructuring the state's portfolio. That divestment would create a $1.14 billion loss due to early sales of the assets, and that over the next 10 years, public pensions would earn $3.6 billion less than if the legislation were not passed. So they said, respectfully, please, Kansas legislature, do not pass this law. A similar analysis in Indiana found that there would be $6.7 billion in losses over 10 years if a similar law were passed. And these are the states themselves doing the analysis. It's not, left-wing faculty on, whatever. And so there are real financial costs here. And so we've seen the passage of these statutes restricting contacts with financial companies that are doing ESG investing, but there's also been the, wait a minute, let's hold on here, there might actually be financial costs. So.
And that's having legislative repercussions. So the not exactly blue state of North Dakota voted 90-3 not to introduce an anti-ESG ban because of this type of analysis. The state of Wyoming, also not a bastion of wokeism, also voted, and so these arguments resonate. When engine number one was mounting its campaign against ExxonMobil, it ran in Texas ads highlighting that Darren Woods received $70 million in surplus compensation while $200 billion of shareholder value was destroyed by ExxonMobil. That governance, ESG, includes governance as well, argument, resonated with shareholders of ExxonMobil in Texas, and they voted in support of the engine number one board slate. So I think there are ways of turning this, making this really clear and resonating with people. I think it's also important to call out, especially with Michael here, who's funding the anti-ESG movement. So there's one thing, I think it's good to get the facts out, and it's good for us to do research. But there's also research on what works on coordinated disinformation campaigns. And it's not just the facts. We have to expose the funders and highlight disinformation so people can see that their votes and their opinions are being manipulated. And so it's the same people who fund climate denial who are funding the anti-ESG movement. It's the same people, some of the same rhetoric. Vivek Ramaswamy has used some of the same rhetoric in the anti-globalist, anti-Zionist conspiracy on the Charlie Kirk show. And he's used that. He's also using, part of the anti-ESG movement. These people are tied to other disinformation campaigns that are systematic and propaganda in their orientation, that have no basis in science, and they need to be called out. And so there's an emotional level to this too, that also has a research component, but I think is, we have to not just do the science, we also have to highlight and expose what is a coordinated political ideological movement as opposed to a fact-based logical one such as we're espousing.
Add a little positivity as well. So having worked in the city space for a long time, one thing that I did notice is that a disaster or a shock to the system brings everybody together politically. So Miami Beach, Miami-Dade, Miami the city, and they were all different politics, but when they have subsidence, which means sinking, then they have sea level rise, and then they had hurricanes and king tides, all sorts of things going on there. So they're all pretty focused on working together. I would say Louisiana went through the same thing after Hurricane Katrina. New York City, we did have, believe it or not, a Republican congressperson who was the main advocate for us about flood insurance. So that actually brings people together from all the different political sides when something major happens. We're hoping that it doesn't take something major to happen, $19 billion and 44 people dying for people to finally come together. That's what happened in New York after Hurricane Sandy, by the way, 10 years ago. for us to come together and say, hey, this is an emergency, let's come across the party lines and not be arguing. So I just wanted to add that little
It's
piece.
really, yeah, it's a great point, and it's really interesting actually to distinguish, that's sort of an environmental shock. SVB was also a shock to the system, but we immediately saw that polarization. And so it's interesting to think about why that happens in that case. Certain types of shocks maybe do lead us in the right direction, others just lead the various sides to double down. This is an area of great interest to our center here, which is the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media, which is really about outreach and communication. And the communication doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens with this stiff headwind that we face in the form of organized denialism. And of course, there's old-fashioned climate denial. But as the impacts of climate change become obvious to the person on the street, and this was the theme of a previous book of mine, there's this move away from the science denial towards other tactics to prevent us from moving on. ESG, the assault on ESG seems to be part and parcel to that new climate war, as I call it. Just thought I would editorialize a little bit there before, thanks. He gets paid $1 for it. It looks like we've got about 20 minutes, is that right?
Yep. So
great.
Good time for Q&A.
And to me, this is the most important part of the event, because one of the luxuries being at Penn, we have brilliant faculty and researchers, but we have brilliant students as well. And so the questions and answers, the discussion part of these events is always really enlightening. So I'm happy to open up the discussion to especially students who want to weigh in, but anybody in the audience really.
I look for students first, but well, for those who don't know me, I'm Eric Bortz. I'm also on the faculty here at Wharton. First, one quick comment, and then maybe I think these are familiar questions, but 2 questions from the academic side of the debate. So the quick comment is I'm a member of the American Law Institute, and that is going forward in the way that you described. My read of it, and I have a blog on this in the Columbia Law's blog, is that they're actually trying to move the clock backward and have shareholder value as being the primary focus, unless there's some kind of departure. Now, on an understanding of a strict understanding of ESG, as kind of Vit had recommended, then that aligns with shareholder value, right? Because as long as the risks are positive to shareholder value, ESG makes sense for that respect. But if you are also wanting firms to take action on climate that is sacrificing of profits sometimes, which my colleague Brian and I have argued, then it's not so good, because then the fiduciary duty is not as expansive as you want it to be. Okay, quick questions. ESG has been criticized in the academic literature as being, first of all, vague with respect to E, environment, that's a huge issue. S, social, that's a huge issue. G, governance, there's lots of debates about governance. And then when you're putting it all together into one metric, some colleagues, particularly on the accounting finance side of the ledger, have said, look, this doesn't mean this is not usable. And so we have cases like ExxonMobil is rated high as an ESG fund, and people say, wait a second, Michael may be surprised to know that, right?
No, I heard that.
Wait, is that right?
Yeah.
So that's one question, is how do we get the metrics right? And then the second question is some other colleagues, again, accounting and finance, have looked at the literature and said one problem is, and this goes to Vit's distinction, is that ESG is created by the financial sellers of funds and sellers of services for measuring companies' performances. But the problem is if an ordinary investor is looking at that, like me, for example, I want to help the climate. And then if the ESG funds are being sold to investors, and the investors think that it's going to be good for the climate and all these other things, but those who are selling the funds really are only thinking about finance, that's where the big argument is that this is a big greenwash comes up, right? That people are being sold something, thinking it's good for the environment, thinking it's good for racial diversity, et cetera, but it's really not. There's a big disconnect. So those are my 2 questions.
It looks like you've got some thoughts here.
Yeah, so Eric, I didn't even plant these questions, but they're perfect for the ESG initiative, because there are really two things that are really central to what we're trying to do. You're absolutely right that most of the ESG data you buy is bad. And it can be misused, and it's misleading, and it's problematic. So let's not measure ESG performance in emojis and Likert scale. Let's measure it in dollars. It's what I did in the total value framework for engine number 1. It's what Schroders is doing. It's what a new company called ESG Impact does. Let's dollarize the externalities that firms impose. And when you do that, ExxonMobil was the single largest destroyer of social value after the tobacco companies in the world, according to engine number 1's framework. And I think that suggested why they went after them. In terms of greenwash, you're right, there's a lot of greenwash going on. And in a paper with Kevin Chua we have under review at Business and Society, for every ESG fund, we score how are they doing in terms of financial performance and ESG performance, and we call out the greenwashers. And some of the most prominent ones are BlackRock's iShares, which is the single largest growing area of ESG funds. And essentially those are benchmark tracking funds with a few exclusions that track the benchmark, whatever the benchmark is. And they're not ESG funds, but they have the ESG label. And so we're gonna call that out. BlackRock is a sponsor of us, which will be interesting.
They got a lot of positive PR about that too. Everybody was talking about BlackRock.
But they're iShares funds, and it's the same with there are great funds out there from Calvert Morgan Stanley, who also is the sponsor of us, from AllianceBernstein, from Parnassus. There are funds out there that our research shows are actually tilted in the right way, but we need more research on both. We need research on how to measure ESG and how to measure ESG funds, and to provide some objective third-party clarity to guide investors, to guide individuals who care about these issues, to follow a more informed process than what's been going on.
It's okay, we cut the feed. So thanks. Did anyone else want to? Yeah, Sarah.
I would actually love to mention this because I'm the lawyer on the panel, and I think that it's really easy sometimes to I also taught negotiation here for 10 years. So what do we teach our students? Look for the win-win. It's not a zero-sum game, right? There has to be a way in which both sides get something, and ESG sounds like the win-win, right? It's the win-win because you're both being profitable in the long run, and you're also protecting the environment. And the problem is, of course, that there are situations in which it's not a win-win. Life just does not always work that way. And I think it's naive to assume that it always works that way. It may work that way sometimes. And that's where the law and ethics are extremely important, right? And that's why we have classes on environmental law and ethics here at Wharton, not just at the law school, right? It's extremely important to understand that to address issues like greenwashing or the integrity of commitments, that not everybody is going to be upfront, and that we need not only the research to show when there's a disconnect between the commitment and the actuality, but also we need legal rules to be able to go after those who are not being truthful, as well as to require upfront disclosures about environmental performance, which can act as not only greater disclosure about sort of what does the real world picture look like, but also to deter, business firms from attempting to pull the wool, right, over people's eyes. So I think that's also really important here and should not be missed.
So what you're saying is it's not always easy to be green.
It is not always easy to be green, right? Yeah, exactly.
We have some questions from the chat.
Oh, well, let's do one from the audience and then one from the chat. Yep.
I'm Dara Bortman. I'm on the board of the American Solar Energy Society, actually. Great to be here, and thank you so much, everyone, for doing this. I want to follow on his question, which talks more about little investors, not big global corporations. But it seems to me like especially our younger generations are really good at, they're vegetarian, they're interested in, avoiding fast fashion and, all of these social issues. But I'm not clear, or I want to know if you guys see that everyone, little investors and up, new investors, are connecting their actions day to day with their consumerism to their first foray into investing, per se. So I don't think everyone thinks about where you put your money, where your values are. You do when you're buying your vegetables because you're a vegetarian or whatever, but is everyone thinking about it, or are more people still just buying general index funds because that's what we've been taught to do, and you don't think about the fact that there's gun companies and oil and gas companies in that index fund? And how do we change that mentality and educate people about investing where your values are right from the start? And how do we change the financial advisory industry that has a lot of, I hate to say it, but old white men in it that haven't been thinking about this forever or for very long, and they don't think about it. So when you go and interview someone to give you financial advice, they're just giving, I think, the same old advice that they've given for 30 years and not incorporating these new ESG concepts. So how do we change that whole?
I was going to say, we have somebody in the audience, I think, who is in the financial investment.
I'm not saying there aren't any investors who do it. I don't know. But I'm saying overall, it seems like, you know, are we making that connection with new, young, or new, old investors to, and when you buy your first stock fund or you buy your first stock, think about more than just profitability, but also, you know.
Did you want to say anything? Yeah, you guys.
Yeah, I'd actually love to kind of address this. So one of the issues that we see in regards to ESG is that a lot of the ESG funds have high fees. So operating in a fiduciary responsibility for our clients, and like we're part of a wealth management team that manages a lot of money, that has a lot of money under management. And so it's hard to go to our clients that are worth quite a bit of money and say, like, there's an extra 10 or 15 or 20 basis points moving millions of dollars into these funds, which equates to quite a bit of extra money. And especially if they're not performing as well as some of the other investment options out there. So that's where we see it in the jobs that we do on a daily basis. And it's a challenge because, yeah, like we would love to move a lot of money into ESG, but do we do it and like sacrifice our own ability to manage our clients' money in a fiduciary way? So that's kind of what we.
You create your own fund.
So thanks, this is great.
I just wanted to add one thing to this because I actually experienced this when I worked for the mayor's office. So I was in our 457 plan and I said, hey, I would love to have an option, and there were no options. So one of the things to think about is for many people, they're only foray in investing until they actually make real money is through their 401k.
Right.
So going to the big company to say you should have options, one or two, where people can make that choice, even if they're willing to pay the higher fees. So maybe starting there before because a lot of people don't have enough money to invest separately until they're in their 30s. So starting with those large companies and their options that they're giving, I think is the best way to start to combat that.
It's a great idea.
Quick comment here, and then we'll go to the, yeah.
Yeah, I want to just follow up on this and ratchet this up just a little bit by adding another metric to ESG, and that's politics. I mean, as somebody that's got a rather mundane retirement account that I don't actively manage, I'm really concerned that I'm holding things where funds might have holdings in firms whose political action committees have contributed to any one of the 147 members of Congress that didn't vote to certify the election the last time around. And frankly, I'm a little bit more concerned. I'm shifting now. Over the last 2 years, I've been more concerned about democracy. Climate's now back in #1 for me. I think we're going to, you know, God help us be okay with democracy. But is there any way something could be created that we could have information about what firms are making those contributions, and we have cleaner IRA funds?
We're also doing that at the Zicklin Center for Corporate Governance and Business Ethics. We fund the Zicklin Center for Corporate Political Accountability. And it doesn't get at who they're funding, but at least gets at whether they're disclosing who they're funding. And there are funds that base their investment strategies on the Zicklin Scores rankings of companies. And so I think we're trying to support that research as well.
Great. It'd be called the Orts Insurrection Index, I think.
I didn't say that.
Did we have a question over here? I thought I saw a hand. Did you still? Yep.
Yes. Hello. Thank you for speaking. I wanted to ask if it's even possible to have a low fee ESG fund, because from what I learned in class, ESG is much more of a sort of a, it's more of a sort of procedural mechanism of, governance as opposed to a selection of the companies that are best for the world. So because of that, I don't see how, it is possible to, like, how would that show up in, say, like a pension fund, or if I wanted to, to put money into public markets, how can I apply ESG thinking or methodologies at all without having to incur extra costs?
Short answer is you can. It's expensive.
Yeah.
And so the question is, can it outperform fees? And so the bar is not just meeting benchmark performance, it's benchmark plus fees, and that's hard. And the evidence is that we're not quite there yet.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay.
We have an online question.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions in the chat. We'll start with this one. With the greenwashing and right-leaning supporters of anti-ESG using that as a prime example of why ESG fails, how do we remove the bad actors of ESG measurement companies?
I guess, yeah, how do we deal with the bad actors in this space?
The
In the ESG.
You mean just the bad data?
The
It
bad,
sounds like the bad ratings.
Yeah, the bad ratings.
Systems.
You develop better ones. That's what we're trying to do.
which is what you guys are doing, yeah. So
You try, it's not easy.
So go to Vit.
No.
But you guys are doing some studies on precisely that, yeah.
And I'd also recommend Roberto Rigobon's the Aggregate Confusion Project at MIT, so it's not just all us. There's also some great work there on how to sift through the data.
So say, contact us offline and we can connect you up. We have another question
Yeah,
online?
we definitely do. So the next question is, amid increasing environmental damage and growing inequities, there are more and more calls for fundamental changes in economic models to ensure people's and planetary well-being over corporate profit. To what extent do you think we need to shift towards alternative economic models that are less growth-oriented to stay within the 1.5 to 2 degree warming? Do you think it would be feasible to transition to a post-growth economy that is increasingly backed by research efforts, including the IPCC?
You guys didn't think we were going to escape that question, did you?
I mean, I think that there are many different forms of business organization in the United States. This is not just the United States issue, right? We haven't even talked about the EU, which frankly is far ahead of the US in many ways and along, many dimensions. I think it may, look, I don't know. I think that the likelihood that we're immediately or within the next 10 years going to shift to a post-growth economy in the United States, I think it's unlikely, but that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be shifts in this direction that are meaningful to rethink, being more circular, to rethink the way that we design products, to rethink the way that we invest our funds. I think all of that is clearly happening. I don't know if we get there in the time frame needed.
Can I weigh in on this?
Oh, sure.
Too?
Yeah.
So there's research on, these public benefit corps and B corps and companies that, sort of state their purpose. And, in Europe, you can actually, there's a movement to, you actually have to, write your purpose down, and then that's enforceable that you're acting according to that purpose. I'd say that the research on these are, on the margin, there's companies that are B corps that do well, but in terms of moving a large system needle, towards 1.5 to 2 degrees, or saving our, democratic institutions, or, these sort of large systemic issues that we have, colored me a little skeptical. But I also don't want to ignore the fact that, a lot of good is done within for-profit corporations. You look at, again, going back to the, what happened during COVID, and, coming up with vaccines, or even there's incredible environmental solutions that are coming out of, venture-backed startups right now that are for-profit. And so, for me, I sort of, where I land on this is, government can't fob off, better angels arguments to companies, right? Like, there's a role for government to regulate, and then there's a role for companies to innovate. And, I think that the fact that if our government is paralyzed, they're sort of relying on for-profit sector to have some better angels, I think is a really problematic place to be. So.
Yeah, I'll just weigh in with my own thoughts here. We have to reduce carbon emissions, and the IPCC report out today underscores the absolute urgency of reducing carbon emissions by 50% this decade. we're not going to remake the global economy on that time frame. We've got to work within the system that exists to accomplish those reductions. And we can work towards changing that system for the better at the same time, but we have to embrace the tools and the institutions that exist now, because there isn't time to wait for something better. And maybe on that note, any remaining thoughts on any of this from panel members before we closing thoughts? Well then, I think we will thank our audience, both online and here, for coming out for this event. We hope that you found it enlightening, and I'm sure there's still pizza left, so please
Plenty
have
of
at it.
pizza.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.